Hi, Misha here. And last time we were shooting, Fox let me know he had never fired any 5.45 by 39 AK74 type gun. And I told him, well, I don't like packing it and 223 5.56 NATO at the same time in the same range bag, because while with care anyone can tell them apart, people get at the range, you get people there, you don't know who's shooting your guns. Things can happen. I'd rather just not. I've always been that way, and I've owned these guns for over 20 years. It's just how I am. Well, I realized when I was packing up for the Thanksgiving trip, we really didn't have any 5.56 guns we needed to shoot. So, why not pack a 5.45? And I thought, which one would be a good one to let him begin with? I already shot the Romanian SLR-2 earlier this year, and it's a great gun, but probably not the best intro. Here is the SLR-104FR. Good gun, and good folding stock on it. But even better is my old SLR-105A1, something we haven't had out in quite some time. Between the more comfy stock and frankly the nicer trigger that came in this one, I thought it would be a perfect introduction, because it is just a bog standard AK74, whereas this is an AKS74, both imported from Bulgaria, where they were built by Arsenal AD over there, Circle 10. So in this video, we're going to let Fox run the 105. I also found some older shooting clips of the 104 we'll sprinkle in for fun. And, of course, we'll go about the history. And while we were shooting the 105, Fox asked some questions, so that seemed a good starting point for kind of how to structure this video. Now, I could delve into other variants like the AKS74U or the RPK74. I don't want to. I want to focus on the rifle itself, revisiting on a past topic. And the very first question he asked me was, why did the Soviets develop the 5.45 millimeter cartridge? Well, the why for this is, of course, this 5.56 NATO, or as it was known at the time, just 223. This cartridge became famous because of Vietnam and the M16, but it actually dates back to the late 1950s and some Armalite AR-15 and Colt AR-15 prototypes. Obviously, the Colt 601 was introduced in very late 1959 and was built around this round. Originally, it was a 55 grain, high velocity intermediate round, and some people just thought of it as a 22, but it was far from that, and the benefits were supposed to be better control, especially in automatic compared to like 7.62 NATO. A soldier could carry a lot more rounds, larger magazines, better flat shooting trajectory, so better accuracy, things of that nature. We can go into 223 another day. More importantly, the Soviets took note, and as early as 1960 or 1961, they had obtained some 223 rounds to study them. Later in this video, we'll see America doing the reverse. They wanted to see what was up, because this might be the new way of rifles. After all, the Soviets developed 7.62 by 39 based on 8mm Kurs, the intermediate round, and essentially helped create the assault rifle category with the AK, and then later the AKM. So was this the next step forward? In the beginning, they basically took 7.62 by 39 cartridges and casings and everything and necked them down to a 5.6mm and worked with them. And this work was really between 64 and 66. By 1967, the very earliest 7.6 round would be kind of prototyped out. Originally, it would have a mild steel core, be about a 53 grain bullet. Later, they would go to a hardened steel core for better penetration, especially with light armor. So that was typed out in 1967, although it would not be adopted officially until 1974 because to fire the new round here, based on this round in a lot of ways, although absolutely not interchangeable, we would need a new rifle. So the reason why was a bit of sincere copycatting, but the Russians weren't new to that, and America wasn't above doing it either. In some ways, I think Russia appreciated the M16 and the 223 round more in Vietnam than America did, at least in the mid-60s. So that's why they made the round. And it does give a lot of advantages. It's actually more reliable, believe it or not, with the new gun and some improvements made. Much better accuracy, a little bit better range compared to 7.62x39. Certainly a lot lighter. Soldier can carry a lot more of these. And partially because of the cartridge itself, and partially because of the rifle adopted with it, it was much easier to control on automatic fire compared to the AK and even the AKM. So with that, let's talk about how the rifle came to be designed around this cartridge. SLR-105. Before we dive in too deep, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, please comment because it's always fun to discuss. And if you really like to help us out, hey, there's a link to our Patreon in the description. Let's get on with it. In 1968, we had the earliest round of trials and really submissions of concept designs, prototype designs. There were quite a few new systems proposed for the new cartridge, including things similar we would see later in the AN94 and the AK107, like the balancing bolt. Some pretty new concepts. And one of the most successful and admitted to kind of the final round of trials was known as the SA006. This proved to have quite good accuracy and hit probability at range. It also was sufficiently durable and reliable, but it was more complicated than the AK. Now, back in 1959, the AKM replaced the original AK, what we know as the AK-47, and a big reason for that was, well, they already were doing it. So again, what Izhevsk did, a team nominally led by Mikhail Kalashnikov, but really he was just kind of at the head of it. He actually didn't even care much for the 5.45 cartridge. They just submitted a reworked AKM known as the A3. They changed what they had to, of course, for the new cartridge and submitted that. So by 1970, we start to see early prototypes and trials beginning thereafter, running through 1971-72. And guess which one they picked? Of course, it was the A3. Even though this reworked AKM wasn't as accurate as the SA-106, what it really had going for it was the name Kalashnikov and the fact that Kalashnikov rifles have been serving the military for over 2 decades. Soldiers knew how to work them, armorers knew how to work on them, and factories knew how to build them. So, cost effective. On top of that, half the parts on a chart would interchange with the AKM, although in reality, it was mostly just things like stock screws, pistol grips, trigger group components. Other things like the extractors and stuff were totally different. And this wasn't just a AKM with a new barrel. They did really make some good changes, which we'll get into. The earliest pre-production rifles were in 1973, and then in 1974 it was officially adopted as Kalashnikov's rifle, model of 1974, AK74, and that 7.6 cartridge, which had pretty much been nailed down since 67-68, was officially adopted as the M74 cartridge as well. And eventually, half a dozen factories would make the cartridge in Russia alone. and there'd be several variants and types. Most of them would be 53 grain, although there would be 57 grain penetrators and otherwise. And of course, we had different magazines, and not only do we have the AK74, we had the AKS74 created and adopted at roughly the same time. That's because Russia was a highly mechanized military with the BMPs and BDMs and BMDs and whatever. So a folding stock model was good for paratroopers and others. So unfortunately, yeah, the SA-006 suffered the fate of many other designs at that period because they wanted to go pretty conservative, which was, well, that's kind of the Brezhnev period in Russia anyway. But I don't want to downplay this gun because it was a step forward in most ways. Although, again, people like Mikhail Kalashnikov felt that 760x39 was the way they should have kind of gone ahead with, but that's neither here nor there. We'll talk about it later. My guns here, I have this SLR105A1 set up as a relatively early 1980s AK74, and this SLR104FR I have set up as a mid to late 80s paratrooper type gun. I've tried to be as accurate as I can, but these guns make it super easy because they're pretty much the only true AK74s, not PM86s, not AK74Ms, not RPKs. These are the only true AK74 imports that I can think of. All the rest were kit builds. So, well, we'll just dive on in here. Why don't we? Starting at the butt, we have a new ribbed butt plate made of metal. We also have this lightning cut in the stock. This had several purposes. One, very easy IDing of a rifle for the new cartridge. Two, kind of makes for a good grasping groove, if I'm being honest. Finger groove, fuller groove. And three, it does actually lighten the stock a wee bit, too. The receiver is still a 1.0 millimeter stamped receiver, and we have a stamped top cover with ribbing. The bolt group is similar, although the extractor on the AK74 is larger for a better grasp on the cartridge as it cycles. That's good. These accepted 30-round magazines, like the AKM before them, but in 1968, AKM mags went to this AGS4 material. It's two halves kind of melded together. Well, the AK74 started off with them too. They're not interchangeable, and actually the mags have a couple of features to make sure that they cannot go in an AKM and vice versa. Forward, the handguards might at first seem the same. The bottom does have the palm swell, but it's a more angular cut versus the more rounded cut of an AKM. It also has a spring in the back to keep it a little tighter. On the upper, we have a spring at the rear of the tube that keeps the gas tube from rattling around. We have the same 1 to 1,000 meter type rear sight with a battle setting. And we have this interesting 90-degree gas block. Let's touch on that more in a minute. Under it we have a cleaning rod, and here we have a 16¼ inch barrel, chrome lined, cold hammer forged, with a 1 and basically 7.87 twist rate. And then moving forward, we have a new front sight with a new 24mm collar, and probably one of the most critical features of the new rifle, whole new muzzle brake with the expansion chamber in the back and a deflection in the front that is exceedingly effective. And while we have a very similar bayonet lug setup, it's moved forward and mounts on the end here. Again, we'll touch on that more in a minute. Flipping it over, the sling swivel on the front's in the same location as on the AKM. On the back, though, like a late AKM, it's on the side of the stock instead of on the bottom. Note that there is not a side rail on this gun. It's actually why I wanted a SLR105A1 and not the R variant, because the standard AK74 at this time did not come with a rail. That was an option, and it was not seen all that often back when. And we had very much an AKM inspired trigger. You know the deal. And of course we have a fixed stock with actually a new style of reinforced rear trunnion. They can take a little more walloping. That's just kind of a brief overview, so we can get to it. The AKS74 is a little more interesting, though. Arsenal 104FR. Originally, this had wood handguards and the standard, we'll call it Bakelite mag, even though we both know it isn't, too. And again, the scope rail would have been optional, so just keep that in mind. No, the difference was totally in the rear. Now, this did require a specially made receiver with an angle in the back and a new rear trunnion. And this is a 4.5mm hinge pin. And we have the button here that folds the stock over. And then there's a spring latch in the front. And of course the sling swivel rotates 360 and moves over to the side so it hangs like that. This is a great improvement over the AKMS, the underfolding version before, for oh so many reasons. It makes the gun only a little bit wider when folded, and if you have a scope rail, even less. Whereas the AKMS folded up on both sides, so it spread it out both ways. It is very flush in the back, and really does save on length. The original AK74 is roughly 37 inches long with the muzzle brake. This, with the stock deployed, is also 37 inches, but with it folded up, it's about 27 inches, so we're saving 10 inches of length. Another impressive thing, this rifle up here is roughly 6 3/4 pounds. This rifle is actually lighter at 6.5 pounds. Again, I'm rounding a bit. Furniture and stuff do matter. But what's more important, the AKMS underfolder was actually heavier because of its stock than the AKM. So they actually managed to make the paratrooper version lighter and more compact. All good things. And we have a better stock to boot. Very easy to deploy. Put your finger in. The latch is in a certain way that is not going to accidentally get hit, but actually can unfold very easily. This is a stamped steel stock. It's very cost effective to produce. And while this isn't the best cheek weld, that's why I actually didn't pick this one for Fox's first gun, it's better than the AKMS. And since the AK74, the 5.45 cartridge, has lighter felt recoil anyway, yeah, cheaper to mass produce and all that good stuff. Another nice thing, this hinge pin pops out extremely easily. Your whole stock comes off, so if this stamped stock does get bent in service, it is very easy for anyone in the field to replace it with a different one, whereas the AKMS underfolder took a little more time and tools. So it's just all around a better mechanism. And that's why we still kind of praise the left side folding version today. Really the only downside is you can't access your scope rail with it folded over, at least not with standard optics. But considering the AKMS presented scope mounting problems itself, that's not really a big deal. So both models were officially adopted in 1974, and by the end of the decade would be in very full swing production. They would first appear to the public in a Red Square parade. Russia likes them some parades, in November of 1977, and it was just coming into somewhat widespread service and use when the war in Afghanistan kicked off for the Soviet Union, and so that's where really where this gun made a name for itself. both versions, both models. It would actually be that war that would inspire quite a few changes to the design, although they had been tinkering with it ever since 1973 with the first pre-production batches. We'll do a run-through of that, but I've teased you and Fox long enough. Let's let him put his first 5.45 rounds downrange ever and get his first impressions right afterwards. Fox's very first rounds of 5.45 through anything.
Whoa.
So what'd you think?
It was like shooting a 22. I mean, truly when you hear that phrase, it was like shooting a 22. This was amazing. I mean, you could bump fire that thing. Just such minimal recoil. And of course, just the quality of the gun. But yeah, I want more. That's what I think.
So back here and back to some details. That almost pre-production batch, 73 through 75, was very AKM-like. We actually had quite a thick rubber butt pad at that time, and it still had a 45-degree gas block. And by 1976, we get into the first true pre-production series, which would last through about a year, and they would start to introduce some changes. Still had the 45-degree gas block for a minute, but we went to a thin rubber butt pad, and we start to kind of have very specific furniture made for this. By 1978, we're really at full production. We've dropped the rubber butt pad completely, going just to the steel ribbed. And this is when we start to see this now famous 90-degree gas block. And as is famously known, that changed the port angle with the barrel. They found that the traditional 45-degree was giving bullet shear and just, kind of negatively impacting the dynamics of the projectiles coming out, so they went to this new gas block. And they introduced this accessory lug for it, which was for things like a grenade launcher, like the GP25. Now the bayonet lug is up here on both. But early on, for the 1970s, we had what we called a single-piece half-moon brake. But around 1979-1980, we introduced this single-piece so-called zigzag brake. They would build roughly 250,000 in this first full production batch, but by the second batch, especially with the Afghan war, they're producing these in the millions, and it would just kind of go on from there. So when you get to the 1980s, changes are aimed at fixing issues, strengthening the gun, but also streamlining and ways to speed up production. For example, we would first go to a Type B and then later a Type C top cover, also known as the lazy one, kind of simplified stamping. We would also go to a bolt carrier with a somewhat reinforced cocking handle. And we would start to introduce more cast parts like the rear sight base. We would also go away from more of an AKM style, rounded off mag catch to this squared off style that's now kind of famous for being the AK74. A little easier to machine, a little easier to use, and a little stronger too. The trigger would go to being a cast component versus machined early on. And we would start to see different types of muzzle device, including a two-piece design, which first appeared around 1983 in Russia. It had more of a simplified but kind of elegant taper. This is a Bulgarian version. It is a two-piece, but it has more of a step because they found that easier to machine. We start to see the zigzag go away and all that. Of course, the most noticeable change has to do with the furniture and the magazines. And it does seem like a starter with the mags. These were quite durable and relatively lightweight, but there was room for improvement. So somewhere between 1983 and 85, we first saw what we think of as plum. Here's one from Tula. The original plum, which was actually just how kind of black came out for them, it's kind of a brownish color, was a shiny material. You see shiny pistol grips and stuff too. But soon that would go to this matte that we know, and they would keep making quote-unquote plum furniture, fixed and folding stock variants, between 1985 and 1988, 1989, somewhere in that interval. This stuff is a fiberglass material. Later it would get replaced by true black, which is a reinforced nylon. We're not quite there yet. We do have a steel heat shield in here. Pistol grip. But it let them kind of phase out wood. Now, they weren't updating guns with polymer if they had wood. It's just if the wood broke, they would replace it with polymer. Sometimes you would even see a mix of wood and polymer on the same gun. Keep in mind the pistol grips were always kind of this Bakelite-y material, although it too would change over time. Just as they were worn out, needing replacing, they would switch them. But at the same time, you can still see some of these today, even over in the invasion of Ukraine, old wood-stocked guns. And yes, I know you can hear hobo too. Here's another one. This is an Mishaco mag. Again, this is Tula. So that's probably the most noteworthy change, is the switch to the plum furniture, followed by true black after the war. There's also a few variants of this stock. This is the Mishaco design, where it's just a straight edge. The Tula folds in, also has a ribbed butt plate for your pleasure. This is smooth. Bulgaria would actually produce a hybrid of this with a ribbed butt plate but these straight edges. Lots of other changes were introduced, but most of them just manufacturing, and I don't want this video to be any longer than it has to be. So with that, let us move on. 105 again. It goes so quick.
Yes, it does.
As to the bayonet, the AK74 originally was issued with the AKM Type 2 bayonet, first seen in 1965, and it had the Type 2 scabbard with the synthetic and metal tip. No insulator needed. We have the sawtooth and the ability to use it as a wire cutter. It's more of a utility bayonet. It would fit on either of these. In 1986, they would introduce what we think of as the AK74 bayonet. I've shown it in several other videos, so I don't really feel like digging it out right now. But it's the black one with the new spear tip. And that was actually made by Bulgaria and Russia. But lots of nations made this style or kind of transitional variants of. But it's neat. You see how the bayonet sticks out a little further because of the muzzle brake. And that is one of the perks, is you do get a little more range just in case you have to go hand to hand. As I said, this really was just in time for the Afghan war, where it received the reputation by the Mujahideen very quickly as the poison bullet. Now in reality, of course, it wasn't that, although it was quite effective. And there were still plenty of AKMs in Russian service because they really only were ramping up production around 1979, 1980 already, so they did not have enough early on. But that didn't stop the U.S. government, namely the CIA, from offering a bounty to any Mujahideen that would capture one and turn it in, and it's reported to be $5,000 for the first one they got, because just as how Russia wanted to study the new 223 round, well, the U.S. wanted to study the new 5.45x39 round. Interestingly, it's about the same length overall as 5.56 NATO, but it has a shorter casing and a longer bullet. Speaking of bullets, there's kind of a neat feature built into the magazines as well. These were issued with 15-round stripper clips. And the magazines have notches on both sides of the rear to accept them, at least the loading tool. It's also an easy way to tell if one of these is correct or not for a 74. And here's our tool, little piece of stamping. Simple and effective. The tool mounts very securely to the back, and then it lets this go. And you just push them in. You would need 2 of these for a 30-round mag, or 3 clips for the 45-round RPK74 mag, which would still fit, of course, an AK74. Inexpensive, but it allowed soldiers to quickly fill up their magazines in the field if needed, taking advantage of their ability to carry more of the lighter weight ammunition. The tool makes loading a stripper clip easier and less stressful on the metal too, because when it's on, it presses in and opens up kind of this gate on the bottom. When it's not on, the shells are quite well locked in. I said earlier that 7 and 6 was nominally, especially with the inner hardened steel core piercing. Just for YouTube, this is not 7 and 6, this is commercial, and everything we've been firing has been a mix of Monarch, Silver Bear, and Wolf, all of which is considered non-armor piercing, just so you know. YouTube. Here are some pouches I pulled out. I've got more. Here's your typical 3-cell. It has 2 belt notches, one for AKM mags, one for AK74 further down. Side pocket, pocket here, 3 mags. Here's a later style 80s one. Note it only has the one spot, and only has a spot for the tube kit, not the oiler. Still 3 mags though. And here's a 4 carrier, probably the most common. This one only has one spot for 74 mags, but others might have 2. We have a large 2 pocket on the side, 4 mags, plus we have this one here. They can hold stripper clips and the guide all in one neat thing. These are all belt pouches. Shoulder straps really weren't needed for these because they're not that heavy. I like pouches. And of course we have our cleaning rod under the barrel if we need it. Yeah. Really fun guns. 104FR. Now, I said earlier, these are really good representations of AK-74 and AKS-74. I also said they're from Bulgaria, Arsenal. Why aren't these Russian? You'd think if the best import would be from there, and we have had Segas. Well, that's because the Sega is based on the AK-74M, or the AK Century, AK-100 series, which started to replace, at Izhmash, formerly Izhevsk, the AK-74 in 1991, although it would take pretty much the whole decade to phase it in. Lots of changes were introduced, including a new smooth top cover, more cast parts, fewer lightning cuts, a 5.5mm hinge in the back, all that stuff. But Arsenal of Bulgaria, well, they kept on with the original pattern. By 1984, Bulgaria had adopted the 5.45 cartridge and the AK-74, as well as the AKS-74 and AKS-74U, the Krink. Not many nations actually did this. In fact, about the only other one to get an official license to manufacture the AK-74 was East Germany, but they only did that for a couple of years. By the time they were switching over, they weren't long for this world, and the wall would come down and so on and so forth. Other nations would adopt 5.45, but not the AK-74, most notably Romania with their PA-86. But it just wasn't all that successful, and it was because it came towards the end of the comm block. Oh well. So Bulgaria would first start assembling guns at the Circle 10 factory using Russian parts. By 1986-87, they were nominally using parts that they made themselves, although they still might have used Russian parts from time to time, especially towards the end when excess parts were, sent down to them, namely from the Tula factory once they were getting out of the game. But getting these imports into the USA, well, that's a story in and of itself. They're really colorful guns in more ways than one. After the fall of communism in Bulgaria, that nation would quickly switch over to using 5.56 and declare 5.45 obsolete. They eventually would join NATO and all that good stuff too. This was a very common thing. It's been asked many times why. I've said in many videos, it's because 5.45 had a stigma in Eastern Europe. It was a sign of Soviet oversight, even oppression. So when they could switch over to 5.56, it was as much a political statement as it was kind of military solidarity with the West and just, interoperability. We saw the same thing in Poland with the switch from the Tanto to the Beryl. Nevertheless, that meant that Bulgaria had quite a few AK74s and tooling and parts. After all, they were still ramping up in the mid and late 80s, and they had just lots going on. This is why we saw a lot of Bulgarian 74 parts kits. But Arsenal Incorporated, Las Vegas, along with Arsenal AD in Bulgaria, thought they could import a civilian legal semi-auto version. Their first effort, around, 2002, 2003, was called the SLR-102. The original SLR-101 was in 7.62x39 and had a milled receiver. Their idea was to do the same thing, but in 5.45. Unfortunately, the 102 never made it past prototype phase and never appeared here. But in 2004, we got this guy. Fox again with the 105.
Very nice.
Right at the time the federal assault weapons ban was ending, these were announced and started to appear sometime between October and December of 2004, and of course running into 2005. The SLR-105 was the first 5.45 gun commercially sold by Arsenal, and it was actually their first on a stamped receiver. All previous Arsenals were on a milled receiver. These shipped with black polymer furniture, usually a NATO stock. The original SLR-105, because of when it came in, had a demilitarized front sight base. No bayonet lug, no threads. Why? Since it was sold right after the ban was over, maybe they just didn't have time to get the parts, or maybe it was a money thing because these were supposed to be cheaper than a milled. Either way, the first ones didn't. The SLR-105A1 here, they would put on a front sight base. One nice thing about the AK74 is you can have both the bayonet lug and the 24mm threads along with the removable brake right here. That was even a thing for the military and why they switched away, because the original AKM with its 14mm threads, those are directly on the barrel. Not only were they finer and more easily damaged, they couldn't take as much weight. The 24mm threads could easily be replaced if they get buggered up. Just pull off your front side base. Much easier to do that than to, try to fix a barrel or rebarrel. And they made efforts to make this a more stable device because it is big and long. They went to eventually the long collar system in Russia with the AK100 series, but all these Bulgarians are the short collar. But they still time up quite well. These are very effective brakes, as you've seen throughout the shooting. We have an expansion chamber back here. We have asymmetric porting to let some gas off there. Bullet comes out, it deflects off this angle in the front and out the sides. Very effective at recoil mitigation. Not so effective at sound. and definitely gives some side blast to anyone near you, but that's kind of all muzzle brakes in general. So that was the original ones. There was also the SLR-105R that had an optional side rail, like this one here. And that would soon be followed by the SLR-105A1R. These rifles were a flash in the pan. They were on the market 2005, but would soon disappear by 2006. Now, a small batch, maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen, was found in the warehouse in 2012 and sold off. But aside from that old batch, that was it. Now, what's interesting about these, in addition to them being the first stamped, is these trunnions are what they call a double rivet trunnion, which you find in Bulgarian kits, but you also find them in Tula production. So many assert that these trunnions used, maybe some other parts besides, were actually, virgin parts that Russia shipped over to Bulgaria in the late 80s, early 90s, and that Bulgaria never built into guns because they were getting away from 5.45, and they were just sitting around at Arsenal, and they said, hey, let's build some guns for the American market on semi-auto only receivers and sell them. So it's possible that these have some Russian parts, or at least a Russian trunnion. So that's why I think having Russian wood on here works real well. As to how many 105s came in, I've seen some people say numbers as low as 200. That I don't believe based on the numbers I've seen in real life and the serials. But keep in mind, Bulgarian serials are not sequential. I've also seen maybe 500 or as high as 2,000. But I would say realistically you're looking at somewhere between 500 and 2,000 because it was a brief run, and that would include 105, 105A1, 105R, and 105A1R. So maybe it's 500 per variant. I don't know. Either way, very short-lived. And this would actually be the only fixed-stocked stamped gun Arsenal would sell for about a decade until the SLR-107R finally came out a few years ago. But of course, that was in 7.62x39. Kind of interesting because they started to go over to folders like this one here. With the sunset of the assault weapons ban, Arsenal thought, let's do side folders. At that time, you really couldn't get a side folder, 4.5 or 5.5 mil pin, at least the left side, in the US. Because again, this takes a dedicated rear trunnion, dedicated receiver. One other thing I forgot to point out earlier, and that the Segas don't have, this does have the grip reinforcing plate. That's just there in case the stock is folded and you happen to drop it on the grip. It just makes sure the receiver may not buckle. The chances of that are very slim, but the military wanted it, and even the original AKMS had it too. So it's a little different styling, 1 rivet instead of I think 3, but I digress. So they thought they would introduce a whole line of side-folding stamped guns. 2005, they prototyped the SLR-104FR in 5.45x39, the SLR-106FR in 5.56 NATO, and the SLR-107FR in 7.62x39. They also announced, even putting pictures up, of another model called the SLR-108. That was to be an AKM. So fixed stock, 45-degree gas block, all that good jazz, in 7.62x39. That would have been interesting because that would have been Bulgaria's very first AKM. They jumped straight from milled AKs to the AK74 and then back to the milled AK in the 90s. So Bulgaria never really built a lot of stamped guns, so the SLR-108 would have been their first. It never came in. Now, ultimately, we did get the SLR-107R, but that was more like this gun, with the 90-degree block, thinner profile barrel, fixed rear trunnion. But I found that kind of fascinating. We never did get a milled either, at least an import. We did get the SA-RPK3, but that was a U.S. assembled gun. So yeah, that was the plan in 2005, rolling into 2006 with the end of the assault weapons ban. It seemed like a good time. The 106 and 107 came in, and not just in the FR variants, but also the combo front sight gas block CR variants, and even the short UR AKSU variants. For whatever reason, though, back then, the SLR-104FR never came to market. The only ones ever made were 5 prototypes, along with 5 prototypes of a 104CR and 5 prototypes of a 104UR. So 15 sample guns, no more. But the other ones, they did come out. I don't know why. It's never been said. I could speculate, but it would just frankly be me guessing. Well, the 104s didn't come out, that is, until much later, 2012. 104FR. Right around the same time they found those few SLR-105s in the old warehouse and sold them, these came out. Well, actually, interestingly enough, the SLR-104UR came out first, soon followed by the SLR-104FR here, with the 16-inch barrel side-folding stock. Interestingly, again, the SLR-104CR never came out. So the only ones here, at least factory, were those pre-production ones, even though the manual actually showed it. Again, why? I think it boils down to the fact that these were just kind of either contractually obligated or they had the parts or something, because it doesn't seem like Arsenal Bulgaria really wanted to do these. And they really only did the 1 or 2 runs. You only see a couple of year dates. You can tell the year on these Arsenals by the first 2 numerical digits of the serial. And so you only see, 2013, 2014 dates. Not much. So these came in very briefly, both the URs and especially the FRs. And what's funny is not only did Arsenal really probably not want to make them, at that time the American public wasn't super keen on buying them either. So it probably seemed like a very logical business decision to just kind of quietly discontinue this line. Quite frankly, the SLR-104FR was a victim of lousy, even terrible timing. Now, if it had been released in 2006, 2007, along with the 106 and 107, that would have been a different story. For one, Bulgaria still had lots of parts and rifles over there, so theoretically they could have kind of done what Romania did and used the kits and built them up with new barrels and receivers to be semi-autos, but they didn't. This is also right after the assault weapons ban was off, so people were really chomping at the bit for ban-free guns, especially folders. And this is when the 7.6 was coming in before it had been banned and was very inexpensive. And this kind of peaked in 2009 when, right after the presidential election, you couldn't get 5.56 223 ammo readily, but you could get 5.45, and if you bought somewhat in bulk, it was 10 cents, around, even less. That spurred a lot of people to get into it. They gave other reasons like accuracy or stopping power. The truth was, it was a good deal. It was cheap and it was accessible. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, I will caution you, shooting any surplus 7.6, it is corrosive. It has corrosive primers because when it was made in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, those were more stable and better for long-term storage, especially in the cold. And I don't know if you've heard this, but Russia is quite cold. So if you do get 7.6, just know all about corrosive. That was the heyday. True, when these came out, we were kind of post Sandy Hook, and there was a gun buying thing, but the world was moving on. 7.6 was about to be banned, And 5.45, even before that, was starting to dry up and starting to crawl up to 25 cents a round for surplus ammo. Now, throughout the whole time, you could still get things like Wolf, which is what I shot from 2002 onward out of guns like this and the SLR2, but people really wanted that surplus stuff. By the time this gun came out, that was drying up, and interest was as well, plus there were tons of kits still out there, and Arsenal themselves, later FIME, introduced the SGL-31 series, Russian-built Segas in 5.45x39. And back in 2005-2006, those guns were not coming into the country, especially the SGL-31s. By 2012, 2013, into 2014, they were everywhere, which is why back in 2014 we did a SLR104FR versus SGL-3194 video. It had a direct competitor from the same importer. Well, virtually the same. So a lot of people went with the Russian, and I don't blame them. It's Russian. And as it turns out, that was kind of the right call because they would be banned via sanction in June of 2014. Yeah, these were really good guns. Very well built. You didn't hear anyone complaining about reliability or longevity. They did complain about the price of around $1,200 when these came out. So much so that by Black Friday of 2016, I believe it was, maybe 2015, Arsenal had to drop these down to $995, by $1,000. Sorry, I've been talking for a while. You might have noticed. For a Black Friday special retail pricing. Dealer pricing dropped about $950, even $925, and that was just kind of getting rid of the last of these. Regularly, these were about $1,100, $1,050 dealer. Like I said, retail around $1,200. They had to beg people to take these. Even myself, I wasn't sure if I was going to keep an FR here. It was a friend who convinced me that it would be a good idea, and boy was he right. It is a nice gun. It just doesn't happen to be as smooth and comfortable as this gun. A big part of it's the trigger. Back in 2004, 2005, the triggers Arsenal was using, very nice. These were fine, but Arsenal went from a pretty small boutique company that sold direct here to only selling via distributors and in the thousands by 2013. Yeah, you can tell. The fit and finish is fine, but the paint finish just isn't as nice as here. I don't know. There's nothing wrong with the 104FR. It shoots very well, but the 105 just shoots gooder. 105 again. 105.
That went quick.
So, of course, with the sanctioning of the SGLs and eventually in 2017, the 5.45 VEPRs, that was kind of the thing too. After the Segas went away, there were 5.45 VEPRs to come in, and people bought those often instead. It just came out at a time when it actually had competition. Probably the worst time in 20 years to release the 104FR was when it came out, because it had direct competition. Otherwise, there would not have been anything. About the only other 5.45 imports were the Romanian SAR2s and Wasser 2s, and Century never brought those over in big numbers. Same goes for the M+M M10 and 5.45. Oh well. Of course, once these finally disappeared, then they became uber collectible. Fun fact too, these were all side folders. Back when the 105s came out, they were all fixed stocks, so some people bought two of these and cut the rear, installed the whole new rear trunnion to make themselves a side folder, instead of just waiting on these, which are factory assembled ones. So, yeah. It's kind of funny how that goes. Over and over in history. There's been little kind of uprisings of 5.45 fans over the last few years, 2019, 2020. But the truth is, the ammo's never been 10 cents again. There have been times when you could find it on shelves easier than 223, but they're usually quite brief. 223 returns. And now with events in Russia in 2022, Most of what we get has been cut off. About the only hope for ammo coming abroad is Romania, because they still technically issue it, although they're trying to get away from it. Of course, Palmetto State and Kalashnikov USA both have said they'll make 5.45 ammo in the future. So I guess I'm a little skeptical. Maybe they will. Maybe at least one of them will. But it's not happening yet, and we don't know for what coin. So my position on, you know what's really funny is, here in 2022, I kind of feel the same way about 5.45 I did back in 2002 when I bought my first one. You had to kind of be careful with the ammo, find it, buy a case or two when you did, because you might not see it for 6 months. It's not hard to find. There are enough guns out there for it, but it's not going to be on every shelf everywhere, and it's not going to be the cheapest. It just is. Unfortunately, it really is fun to shoot, too. Oh, and before anyone asks, I have no idea how many of these came in. Thousands. Or, for that matter, the 104 UR. I will say the 104 FR sold out long before the last 104 URs. Like anything else, now that the 104 URs are gone, now people appreciate them. I always thought they were cool for being factory AK74 used, but they had their own issues, and that's really a story for another day. But yeah, the Bulgarian guns, because they started building theirs in the mid-80s, are perfect snapshots of a mid-80s Russian production style. And so that's why these are great to turn in. Both came with black polymer furniture, but I put the plum on this one and the Russian wood on this one. Really like it. I think it jumps out, and it's just a bog standard AK74. A really cool enemy rifle for anyone who grew up in the 80s, 90s. And these were a mystery. Even when we got our first import with the Romanian guns, those weren't true AK-74s as much as we really wanted them to be. So when these came out, that was great. And when these came out, that was great. I never could tell you which is better, this 104 or the SGL-31. I would just say they're both really good in their own way, because they are technically different guns. But really wanted to share this with Fox and with you, kind of revisiting as we get to the end of 2022. Plus, as I've said earlier, we are seeing these over in Ukraine on both sides, so they're kind of historically relevant yet again. Well, another long video where I mostly just ramble on about AKs. I appreciate you hanging out with me. Hope you did enjoy it. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support myself and Fox, check out the link to the Patreon page for the channel. But if you can't, I understand that too. This is Misha, and on behalf of us both, thank you, and hope everyone has a good holiday season, Merry Christmas, and all that good stuff. We'll catch you very soon next time.